Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Lead Like a Pro. My name is Helen Liu, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation, whose mission is to raise private funds for the library. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat. I will also post a link to the evaluation form, so please take a moment after the program to share your thoughts. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Matthew Raidbard has spent the past 15 years as a men's college basketball coach and senior level college athletics administrator. While pursuing his doctorate in educational leadership, he conducted research on athletic coach leadership practice that led him to determine that coaches were not being provided the tools and resources required to take on the outsized leadership role they were asked to take on for their athletes and team. This discovery was the inspiration for his new book, Lead Like a Pro: Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches, where he provides coaches at all levels of sports with tools to enhance their leadership practice and become more effective leaders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raidbard.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you so much to the library for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. Really excited to be presenting about my new book, Lead Like a Pro. When I do speaking engagements or author talks, I always like to start with a story about how I kind of got started in leadership and really started learning about the importance of leadership for athletic coaches. It was always my dream to be a college basketball coach. And when I was getting ready to graduate from Indiana University for my undergraduate, I really felt like that was the time, if there ever was one, to pursue that dream. So I started trying to do whatever I could to break into college coaching. And I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to get a job as an assistant coach at a small Division II school in the southwest corner of New Mexico called Western New Mexico University. And I was so excited when I got the job, and I was so happy to be kind of getting the opportunity to live my dream. But when I accepted the job, one of the requirements was that I was enrolled in a graduate program. And at that point, I was very singularly focused. I really was just focused on being a coach. So whatever they asked me to do, enroll in a graduate program, take on other jobs, responsibilities, whatever it was, I was going to do it. I moved from where I was living in Chicago at the time to Silver City, New Mexico. And I remember on my first day at Western New Mexico, spent the morning just kind of getting acclimated to the university and the athletic department and meeting people and meeting the team and just kind of settling in. And then after lunch, I went to go meet with my advisor to pick a program for me to enroll in. And when I got there, she told me that I could only get into 2 master's programs. My undergraduate degree was in history and classical studies. And there were only 2 programs that I met the requirements for admission. One was counseling and one was educational leadership. And so we put the programs side by side and we did kind of a pros and cons list of both. And as we kind of went through it, we could both see how each program would be applicable to my pursuit of coaching and my kind of career path. And as we got to the bottom, there was a timeline for each of the programs to get you through to graduation. And the programs were exactly the same in terms of the timeline, 2 years, but the counseling program required a 6-hour summer internship in addition to your fall and spring coursework. So I decided based on that to choose educational leadership. And I didn't know it at the time, how huge of a decision that actually was and how much it would influence my professional career. But one thing it did was it gave me a lot of foundational leadership knowledge early on in my career. And also it kind of opened up my eyes to the fact that, I was extremely fortunate to be receiving all of this leadership training, all this leadership education as a result of my program. But as I kind of went on with coaching and met other coaches and progressed in the profession, I realized that, a lot of other coaches, their degrees were in a lot of other different programs, a lot of other different things, and they weren't necessarily getting that same leadership training and education that I was fortunate to get just based off of the program that I selected for my master's. So, that was really, that's really a defining part of my career, and eventually led me to go back to school later on to pursue a doctorate and conduct research and write the book to try to provide coaches with the resources and tools to help them become better leaders. So that is a little about me. The last 15 years, I've been a men's college basketball coach and a college athletics administrator, and my background is in educational leadership. That's what I've gotten my master's and doctorate in, and that's really what is, leadership for coaches. Leadership in general has just really been my focus and my passion for over the past decade that I've been in coaching in college athletics. The thesis of the book, what I want everybody to just start off with is the idea that coaches are leaders, and that's coaches at all levels of sports. I oftentimes hear from coaches that, college coaches are leaders or professional coaches are leaders. If it's your full-time job, then you're a leader. But all coaches at all levels of sports are leaders. Parents who are volunteer youth sports coach for their kids' team, high school coaches who are also teachers. Everybody who's a coach is taking on a leadership role, and they are a leader. And as kind of taking that one step further, all of the decisions that coaches make that relate to their team and their program and their athletes, those are leadership decisions. And that's another thing I hear a lot from coaches at all levels is, the really big decisions. Who plays at the end of the game, or who you start, or what you focus on at practice, or what plays you run that have the most impact on outcomes or winning and losing. Those are really leadership decisions. But what I want coaches to know is that all of their decisions are leadership decisions, no matter how small or how big. They're all leadership decisions. What time you show up for practice, or what time you leave afterward, how accessible you are. How much one-on-one individual consideration you give each athlete, how in tune you are with your athletes. Are you listening to your athletes? Are you giving them input? How you communicate with your athletes? Do you yell corrections across the field in real time, or do you wait till the play is over and then have your athletes come over and talk to them on the sideline? All of these are leadership decisions. All of these are going to impact, not just winning and losing, but also, what type of experience do your kids have? How do they perceive, their place on the team or in the program? How do they fit in with the team? Do they continue with the sport after the season's over? Do they develop an attachment to it? All of these decisions are going to have an impact on that. So that's why coaches need leadership training and education. And that's coaches at all levels of sports, regardless of experience level or past success level. The leadership style a coach practice is always evolving as the needs of their kids are always changing. And that's why it's so important that coaches are always receiving leadership education and training so that their leadership style can keep adapting to best meet the needs of their team and of their athletes. And the other part of that is, coaches today, and it's increasing every year, are asked to wear so many hats, take on so many different responsibilities for their teams and athletes that, they really need leadership training and education to be able to take on that outsized role. When I first went down to Western New Mexico, I remember, it was a 24-hour drive. It was 1,600 miles. And I remember I was in the car the whole time thinking how amazing this was, that my full-time job was going to be recruiting and coaching on the court and doing workouts and all of these, breaking down game film, all of these things that I associated with coaching and with day-to-day coaching. And I assume those are going to be the overwhelming part of my job. And I remember I was at school for about a month, and I was talking to my dad, and he was asking me how things were going. Was I enjoying it? Was it what I thought it was going to be? And I remember telling him, everything was going well. I love the coaches, the team, other members of the athletic department, the university. I really liked everything. But I was wondering, and I just didn't understand when I was going to get to do all of those basketball things, the recruiting and the coaching on the court, when I was going to get to do all of those things, spend my time focusing on all of those things. Because I was splitting my time, or a large portion of my time was going towards doing so many other things that I hadn't anticipated and didn't necessarily have the kind of well-developed leadership capabilities to take on. I was a mentor, I was a friend, I was a sounding board, I was a chauffeur, I was a class checker. I was doing all of these other things. And, I had come down there thinking I'm going to be a basketball coach. That's going to mean I'm going to wear certain hats. And I was wearing all of these other hats that I didn't have a developed enough leadership practice to be able to take on in a way that oftentimes my athletes needed me to. So, a lot of what I talk about in the book and from my research is talking about the leadership gap. So, kind of what my research uncovered and is that, oftentimes or predominantly the most successful coaches, they've been able to narrow the leadership gap. So what that means is the leadership style they think they're practicing, their perceived leadership style, very closely aligns with the leadership style that they're actually practicing. So those coaches have figured out, based on their personal values and beliefs, based on who they are as a leader, what's important to them, they've figured out a leadership style or styles that they want to practice that works well for them. And then they've acquired the tools through experience and knowledge and training to go and actually practice it. And that's kind of the recipe for really setting yourself up to be a successful coach. It's kind of aligning your perceived and your actual leadership style. So, what that kind of looks like. So for me, I first, when I first got into coaching and as I went through my first couple of years as a coach, I figured out what were the most important things to me as a coach. What were my values and beliefs? So, for me, I just believe in just being really positive. It's my job to be inspiring and motivational to my athletes, to help them believe that they can achieve more than they thought they could, that they can be greater than they thought they could. And that, I really try to develop really strong personal relationships with my athletes based on mutual trust and respect. And, that's something, those kind of core values and beliefs are really important to me. So once I figured that out about myself, once I knew that about my leadership style, then I could say, what leadership style or behaviors really lends itself well to that. And for me, it was transformational leadership. I was really drawn to that early on. Inspirational motivation, building strong relationships, clear and direct positive communication. Those were so important to me, and they're also foundational to transformational leadership. So once I kind of aligned, this leadership style is going to work really well with who I want to be or who I feel I am as a leader, it was then about acquiring the tools to go out and practice it. And that can oftentimes be the most difficult step, is figuring out who you are as a leader, and then figuring out a leadership style that works for you is so important. And it takes time and reflection, but then getting the tools to be able to then go and actually practice that leadership style or styles with your team so that you get the desired results can be difficult. For me, when I was kind of figuring out my way as a transformational leader, one of the mistakes I made early on was, I went out and I tried to use really clear and direct positive communication with my athletes to give them corrections or give them coaching or, and make sure they understood what my expectations were. And I think I early on did a good job of that. The problem that I ran into early on in my leadership practice was I did all of that up front, and then I would oftentimes I would let the athletes go off and then try to take what I gave them, the corrections or the advice or whatever it was, and try to then institute those improvements on their own. And I became kind of disconnected. I kind of moved on to another athlete or to another task. And, when athletes would come back to me and they would have made a lot of progress or they would have achieved a goal, I would be really effusive in my praise. I'd be really happy for them and really supportive. And so, but the problem was my results were very up and down. They're very inconsistent because for the athletes who didn't need a lot of inspiration and motivation along the way, they were able to work through the challenges and achieve the outcomes without me or without me being very involved. But for a number of my athletes, they were becoming discouraged because when I let them go off on their own and didn't check back in, I wasn't providing them with the motivation or inspiration that they needed along the way. And so what I realized in that experience was, and the tools that I acquired were so important and impactful for me actually practicing transformational leadership. I learned that, my leadership style, it's not going to change for every athlete, but my approach is going to change for every athlete. So I'm going to be a transformational leader for every athlete, but some athletes are going to need, that's going to look a little different. They might need a little more inspiration or motivation. Other athletes might not. And I'm going to need to figure out what are the needs of my athletes so that my leadership practice can best meet those needs. So, how this all kind of takes shape is through coaches making intentional leadership choices. And what that means is, before you can start making leadership decisions, you've got to ask yourself some really important questions about, what you want for your team. What are your goals? What's important to you as a leader? What are the needs of your athletes? Because ultimately, the answers that you have to those questions are going to drive your leadership decisions. So, if what's important to you as a leader is for all of your members of your team to have fun, or to learn a new foundational skill, or to acquire the understanding of a team first mentality and hard work, the leadership decisions that you make are going to be in pursuit of those outcomes. So if your goal is to have fun, your leadership decisions or a number of your leadership decisions are going to be in pursuit of that. So, you might say that you're going to try to figure out at least one game every practice to try to teach a new skill in a fun way. Or you're going to try to be really engaging for your athletes. You're going to try to build really strong relationships with them so that they know you're supporting them and you care about them. So these leadership choices that you're making are going to be very intentional in pursuit of what your goals are. So, I kind of now want to shift and talk about some different leadership styles that are really good for coaches. And, when I set out to write the book, what I wanted to do was I wanted to provide coaches with a resource, and I wanted to provide coaches with a menu. I don't go into the book and I would never tell coaches, this is a leadership style you should practice, or this is the best leadership style for coaches. Every leader is different, every coach is different, and every coach practices a different leadership style. Me as a transformational leader is different than another coach as a transformational leader because, our personalities are different. We have different character traits. Our strengths and weaknesses are different. We have different communication styles. So we might both be practicing transformational leadership, but it might look different. It's going to come off a little differently, and it's going to achieve potentially different results. And, a common mistake that a lot of young coaches or coaches that are new to the profession make that I made when I was first getting into coaching is they try to look at what the most successful coaches are doing and they try to replicate those behaviors. And while I completely understand that approach because I did that as well, I thought, a really great way for me to figure out how to be a leader is watch successful coaches and then mimic them because clearly they're practicing the best leadership style and behaviors. The problem is that, I'm not them. And a big reason why that leadership style is so successful is because they figured out what works for them. They've aligned that leadership style with their core values and beliefs, and then they've acquired the tools to go and effectively practice it. And that's where the disconnect is for a lot of coaches. And that's why I tell coaches that, leadership, you want to observe successful coaches for sure. You want to be informed by what they're doing. There's tons of things to learn, but ultimately, the leadership style you practice needs to be reflective of who you are and true to who you are. And so these are some different leadership styles that are really good for coaches to practice. And the other thing I'll say is, no coach practices only one leadership style. So even though as a coach I define myself as a transformational leader, that was the foundation of my leadership practice. I practiced a lot of different elements of transformational leadership, but I also practiced elements of other leadership styles. I practice elements of servant leadership, democratic leadership. I might only practice one key behavior of each of those leadership styles, but they all, kind of meld together with transformational leadership to form my unique leadership practice. So the first leadership style that I want to talk about is transformational leadership. And obviously that's one that's really important to me, really important to my leadership practice. And the foundation of it is inspiration and motivation, working to inspire and motivate your athletes to achieve goals, to achieve results, to make progress, to learn, grow, and develop. And coaches do that through inspiring confidence in their athletes, using really positive motivation, instilling in your athletes a sense of purpose. Those are some of the tools to help motivate your athletes. You're doing that through clear, positive, and direct communication. And that doesn't mean that a transformational leader is only providing praise all the time. As a transformational leader, I still need to provide corrections, or I still need to give my athletes constructive criticism. But it's how you do it, though, as a transformational leader. The way that I did it as a transformational leader was I tried always to provide constructive criticism or feedback one-on-one with my athletes as much as possible, to do it face to face, and to try to do it in a supportive way. I try to use the word we as much as possible, and not you need to fix this or you need to make this adjustment. We're going to fix this. We're gonna overcome this adversity. We're gonna face this challenge. And that way your athletes know that they're supporting you and that you're invested in them. It also helps you to build really strong relationships with your athletes, which is so important for transformational leadership. And then, again, I think it's talked about a lot in coaching, and it's so important, is kind of playing up the strengths or playing to the strengths of your athletes. I think sometimes an overlooked part of that is, it's not only about therefore playing to the strengths and masking the weaknesses of your athletes, but it's kind of, masking the weaknesses while you help your athletes turn those into strengths or improve on those weaknesses. And I think sometimes for transformational leaders, that can get a little bit lost, that you still do want to look at what those maybe some of those areas where athletes can have improvement, and you want to work to improve those athletes through coaching, through your transformational leadership. So the next leadership style that I think is just really great for coaches. I know that I practice elements of it. I think as an administrator, I practice even more elements of servant leadership than I did as a coach. My leadership style has changed and evolved in that way. I definitely went from feeling like I was mostly a transformational leader as a coach to now as an administrator. Yeah, I feel like I'm a transformational leader and servant leader. I feel like those are kind of both the foundations of my leadership practice. But it's about putting the needs of everybody else above your own. And to me, everybody who makes the decision to become a coach is, at least in some small way or to some degree, a servant leader. Because I just believe that the act of being a coach, which means that you are now, your job or your role is to help others learn, grow, develop, improve, become better. Ultimately, you're putting their needs above your own. There's a lot of other careers that coaches could be doing that could more directly benefit or better them, that isn't so focused on other people. And so I think that the idea of, coaches being a servant leader is really ingrained in the decision to become a coach. Servant leaders also model really great behaviors: unselfishness, empathy, listening, inclusion, teamwork, making sure that everybody on the team is valued, knows they're valued, and feels like they're an important part of the team, whether they're the best player or they're a player who doesn't play very much. Servant leaders work to make sure everybody is valued and everybody understands that they have a role, and it's all important to overall team success. And then the last one that I'll talk about that's really key to servant leadership that I think is so important that a lot of coaches don't necessarily focus on is working to develop and enhance the leadership abilities of all your team members, not just your coaches, but also your athletes as well. And, that could be very difficult for coaches. I know that, for myself, I went through this a lot in my coaching career where, I was a very singular voice to where, I was the first one to provide praise. I was the first one to provide corrections. And even though that's a very fundamental role of a coach, and I think it's a very natural role for a coach to take on, it's a very natural instinct for a coach to see something good and praise it, or a coach to see something that isn't correct and want to correct it. The problem is that when a coach is constantly that first voice in either one of those scenarios, they're not allowing for the opportunity or the room for others to be leaders, to take on a leadership role. And it's so important that coaches leave that space so that others have the opportunity to step into that role as well. So I encourage coaches, when you see something happen that's really great, throughout a practice or a workout or a game or any team activity, or you see something that needs to be corrected, give it a second, if you can, or at least pick out a few times during practice or wherever you are to just give it a second. Just give that space for a player or one of your athletes or other coaches to step in and say, that was really great, well done, or you know what, we should have done this. Let's do it again. Let's fix it. Let's figure it out. Give them that space to go and do that. And if you're finding that you don't have any athletes in particular who are stepping into that role, a really good way to kind of encourage them into that role and help them kind of develop their leadership abilities is to kind of cue up that opportunity by saying, okay, something happened on that play that wasn't correct. Does anybody know what should have happened? And kind of give them that nudge into that leadership space so that they can hopefully begin to acquire that voice as a leader. And ultimately, that's so important because not only does it help build a stronger team culture, stronger team foundation, but ultimately it kind of saves your voice as a coach because you're not the one who's always in that leadership role. The athletes are, hopefully over time taking more of that leadership role for you, which saves your voice from being tuned out. And it also helps in those situations on the court or field where, the athletes are out there, they're playing, they're competing. They could be helping and leading each other on the fly when, it might be harder for you to do so. So I think that's a really important aspect of servant leadership that I always encourage coaches to really try to explore and add to their leadership practice if they feel like it works for them. Another leadership style that has been, I think, gained a lot of popularity amongst coaches in the last, say, 10 or 15 years is democratic leadership. Athletes nowadays have access to more information faster than ever before. And they also have more platforms to give their opinions or voice their thoughts or concerns or comments than ever before. And as a result, they're more comfortable than past generations have been with giving their opinions, giving their inputs. And I think a lot of athletes, an increasing number of athletes every year, are looking for coaches to practice some form of democratic leadership because they want to have input into team decisions. They want to have their voice heard within the team. I think that's so important for coaches to consider practicing because it definitely helps to meet the needs of your athletes. Now, one thing I do kind of caution coaches with, because with every leadership style, there are going to be some unintended consequences of those actions that you're going to kind of need to work through or mitigate. And so what I kind of encourage coaches to just be just a little cautious about is democratic leadership is a participative democracy where coaches are encouraging all team members to participate in the decision-making process by giving their input, thoughts, and ideas. But it's not a voting democracy. So as a coach, as the leader, you're ultimately responsible for making team decisions and you're responsible for their outcomes. So, if you have to make a decision and you ask for everybody on the team's input, and it comes down that, the kind of final tally was 10-9 and you were in the 9, that doesn't mean that you should go with whatever the kind of slim majority felt the decision should be. Obviously you want to take all thoughts and ideas into consideration, but that doesn't mean you want to change your perspective and do something different. Now, if the voting came back 17-2, I still would tell coaches that doesn't mean you should automatically change your decision and do a complete 180, but it does mean that you might want to get some input from other coaches or colleagues or friends, or run it by the scenario by some other people that you trust, to kind of get their perspective, to make sure you're looking at it through the kind of correct lens, or you're looking at it from the best angle. And you still then might make that decision, that minority decision that you believe, because ultimately the decisions you make, you have to believe in them in order for them to have any chance of being successful. But in that case, you might need to do a little more explaining to your athletes and team members to say, I understand this is what the majority felt, but as the coach, I listened to everybody's opinions, I thought about it, and this is ultimately the decision I'm going to make, and this is why. And that way you can kind of keep the buy-in and make sure that everybody understands that you didn't just get their opinions and then still go with what you thought, that you really took their input seriously and really considered it. And then the last leadership style that I want to touch on is transactional leadership. It's a leadership style that I think, anybody who's played sports, growing up or high school, college, they've more than likely had a coach who practiced some elements of transactional leadership to some degree. But the foundation of it is trying to achieve usually short-term goals through a contingent rewards or punishment system. So the idea being that, if you're as a basketball coach, if I'm trying to get my team to improve our shooting, I might set the goal that we're going to do a shooting drill and I want my team to make 50 shots in 5 minutes. And I tell them that if they do it, if they achieve the goal, that we can take a break and get water. If they don't achieve the goal, then they have to run to the end of the court and back. So the idea being that in order to achieve this new goal, that the athletes will either be motivated by wanting the reward to work harder and be more focused, or deterred from any type of negative behavior and be motivated to work harder and focus because they won't want the punishment. So whereas this leadership style I think has become less popular over time, I think in past generations, I think transactional leadership was one of the predominant leadership styles for coaches. It's definitely a leadership style that, while coaches don't use it as much now, it's definitely one that I think still can have an impact for coaches, particularly when you're focusing on the reward and you're combining it with another leadership style, and you're also using it very intermittently. If you feel like your team's hit a plateau, you're looking for a little extra motivation, kind of putting that reward out there or that incentive can kind of help you kind of get over that hump to achieve a short-term goal. And then pairing it with transformational leadership, I think will help coaches achieve that outcome a lot better, and also kind of get better buy-in from their team, because instead of just kind of standing there and saying, all right, the clock started, you're either going to achieve the goal or you're not, kind of taking that next step and really trying to be inspirational and motivational and coaching them through it shows your team that you're really invested in getting them to that reward, and that's ultimately what you want. And that you're really kind of focusing on helping them achieve it. It's not just about them, it's about everybody on the team. So in the kind of last part of the presentation here, I just want to talk a little bit about, how do you know if your leadership style is working? And, I think that's something that a lot of coaches are thinking about a lot and can be struggling with at times, particularly when they're not getting the results or they're not achieving the goals that they had hoped for. But ultimately, it kind of fundamentally comes back to, the questions that we asked earlier. Are you getting the answers, or, to what degree are you getting the answers to those questions? If one of your goals was for your kids to have fun, are they having fun? Did all of your kids come back for the next year? Were you getting really good feedback from them and their parents about having fun? Were they excited to show up at practice? Were they happy leaving? But all of those cues can kind of help inform whether or not you feel like you really achieved that goal. And if you didn't, as well as any other goals or expectations that you might have had, that's perfectly okay. It's not, you're not a failure as a leader because everybody didn't have as much fun as you had hoped. Certainly it's fair to be disappointed or feel to a certain degree like you didn't accomplish your goal, but ultimately there's no such thing as a perfect leader. You're never going to achieve 100% of the outcomes or the goals that you want as a leader every time. Even the most successful leaders are going to have leadership successes and failures. They're going to have ups and downs. The defining factor for you as a leader is not about whether or not ultimately and that in that season or in your short-term goals, how many you succeeded in or how many you failed in. It's ultimately about the leadership journey. And it's about constantly trying to work to improve your leadership practice, to be a better leader for your athletes and your team. And if you're doing that, if you're working to always be a better leader, to make the best decisions that you can, to hopefully help them have a great experience and improve and have the team be successful, then that's a successful leader, regardless of how many times it ultimately works out in the end. Because I can speak to this as a leader. There have been a lot of times in my coaching career where I look back and I think I made all of the right leadership decisions for the right reasons, and I didn't get the right outcome or the outcome that I'd hoped for. And there have been times where I didn't make great leadership decisions and I wish I could have did things differently and I got the outcome I had hoped for. But ultimately it's about that process and really, being able to reflect on and look at, did all the decisions I make align with who I am as a leader? Were they for the betterment of my team and athletes? And if they were, then that's your focus, then ultimately, you're going to continue to be a successful leader. So that is my presentation. Book is called Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get books. Really appreciate the library for having me come and present tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who attended and listened. I really appreciate it.